The forest was ancient, its trees, gnarled and towering, whispered with the wind as if holding secrets long buried in the earth. The dense canopy above, a tangle of thick branches, filtered the light into fractured beams, casting the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. In this secluded corner of the English Channel, only a few souls ventured. Those who had learned the rhythm of nature, those who understood its delicate balance. Elliot Weston had come to the island 3 months ago. A conservationist, he was tasked with protecting a species on the brink of recovery, the Great Crested Grebe. With a strong, streamlined body and hauntingly beautiful plumage, the bird had once teetered on the edge of extinction, its numbers decimated by hunting for its feathers. Now, in this remote sanctuary, the grebes were slowly returning to their ancestral nesting grounds, but their revival came with its own challenges. The island was a sanctuary of sorts, cut off from the mainland by a cold, turbulent sea. Thick forests stretched across its heart, fringed by sharp cliffs that dropped into the churning waters below. The island was isolated, difficult to navigate. Even the weather here was unpredictable. Elliot had grown used to its moods, the frequent winds, the mist that rolled in off the sea, obscuring his vision and muffling sound. He had become part of the landscape, his movements as quiet and deliberate as the animals he watched. The grebes had returned, but so too had an unspoken tension. The forest, alive with life, now seemed to hum with an unfamiliar energy. Elliot could feel it in his bones, the way the wind had shifted recently, the sound of movement in the underbrush when nothing appeared to be there. The bird's behavior had changed. He walked through the forest early that morning, the cold air biting at his skin. His boots crunched over the damp leaves, the faint sound of his breath mingling with the rustling of trees. The grebes had chosen a quiet cove for their nests, tucked away behind thick undergrowth, away from the larger predators that roamed the island. It was a perfect spot, secluded, hidden from the prying eyes of the world, but recently there had been signs. Small disturbances that did not belong. Today, something felt different. As he reached the edge of the cove, the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. A soft wind stirred the leaves, and for a moment everything seemed still. The quiet felt unnatural. There were no calls from the grebes, no rustling from the smaller birds. The air hung heavy, like a storm was about to break. Elliot crouched low, blending into the foliage, his heart beginning to beat a little faster. His eyes scanned the trees and the shore, searching for any sign of movement. His breath was shallow, barely audible over the wind. He saw nothing, but he felt something, an unmistakable presence. The forest suddenly seemed alive with sound. The swish of feathers in the wind, the crunch of something moving quietly through the underbrush. A slight rustling in the bushes caught his attention. He froze. A shadow shifted among the trees, its silhouette barely discernible against the gray backdrop. A shape. Slowly, with deliberate caution, Elliot moved closer, taking care not to disturb the undergrowth. His pulse quickened. The shadow was not large, but it was moving deliberately toward the cove. Something was wrong. It wasn't a natural presence. The wind picked up again, carrying with it a faint scent of something unfamiliar, musky, almost metallic. Elliot knew that scent well. It was the smell of something predatory. A figure had emerged from the trees. It was hunched, its movements slow and calculated. A man. Elliot's heart raced as he watched the figure, his eyes narrowing. He had heard rumors of poachers in the region, hunters who had no respect for the sanctity of the wildlife on the island. But this man was different. There was something off about him, something unsettling in the way he moved, almost as if he was part of the very shadows he stalked. Elliot's thoughts scrambled as he carefully inched closer. He couldn't let the grebes be harmed. Not now. Not after all the work he had put into protecting them. The man's attention was fixed on the cove, and Elliot could see his eyes flicking toward the hidden nests. With a sudden burst of motion, the man lunged forward, crouching down as he moved through the underbrush with surprising speed. Elliot had no choice. He had to act. He quickly ducked behind a cluster of thick ferns, his heart pounding. He was mere meters from the intruder now. The man moved closer, his presence now so palpable that Elliot could almost hear his breathing. The rustling of leaves stopped. The forest grew silent again, except for the distant rush of wind in the trees. Elliot watched the man drop to his knees, his hands shaking as he reached out toward the nearest nest, where a solitary Great Crested Grebe stood guard over her eggs. The bird flapped its wings in protest, but the man was quick, his hands clamping down on the delicate creature. A sudden noise broke the tension, a soft crack from behind Elliot. He spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. There, standing just feet away, was another figure, tall and quiet, eyes glinting with a strange familiarity. Another poacher. But this one was different. The man had a strange predatory calm to him, his face cold, his movements unnervingly smooth. He was the one who had been watching from the shadows, the one who had led Elliot to this trap. The first man, now with the grebe in his hands, turned to the newcomer. But before anything could happen, the silence was shattered by a sound unlike any Elliot had ever heard. A loud, violent thrashing from the cove. The second poacher's eyes widened. The first man turned, confused. And then they both saw it. The forest exploded into movement, a flurry of wings and feathers. Hundreds of Great Crested Grebes, emerging from the trees and bushes, flooding the area in a chaotic wave. The creatures, in unison, descended upon the poachers, their wings beating furiously, their sharp, sleek bodies darting through the air like living arrows. In an instant, the men were overwhelmed, stumbling backward, their eyes wide in shock and panic as the grebe swooped down on them in a frenzy of feathers and shrill calls. The force of the bird's attack was blinding, swift, brutal. The men had no chance to defend themselves, their hands scrambling to shield their faces as the geese closed in, tearing at their arms and claws. Elliot froze, watching in disbelief as the birds protected their young. Their aggression was not just instinct, it was something deeper, something desperate. In those moments he understood the balance of nature that had been restored here. The geese, once hunted for their feathers, now protected by the very place they had sought refuge. This was their land now, and nothing would harm them again. The storm raged on, the men retreating, their defeat clear. The grebes, satisfied, gradually retreated back into the trees, disappearing as quickly as they had arrived. The forest fell silent once more. Elliot stood in place, his heart pounding as he watched the birds return to their nests. In that moment, he realized that the island wasn't just a sanctuary, it was a battleground. And it was clear now more than ever that the grebes would do anything to protect their future. So too would he. As the wind carried the feathers into the sky, Elliot took a deep breath, letting the wind settle around him. The tension had broken, but he knew it was only temporary. The island, like the world beyond it, was fragile, and nature's delicate balance was one that would never be easily won. Elliot remained still, his breath slow and shallow as the final echoes of the grebes' battle faded into the distance. The wind had quieted, but a lingering tension still hung in the air, thick like fog. His eyes scanned the cove once more, where the grebes had returned to their nests, some preening their. The poachers, who had, until moments ago, seemed so invincible in their quiet, deliberate pursuit of profit, were now nowhere to be seen. Their trail was scattered, leaving nothing behind but the telltale remnants of a hurried retreat, broken branches, a torn jacket, and the distant, muffled sounds of footsteps as they fled into the heart of the island. their pride broken, their plans thwarted. For a moment, Elliot considered following them, ensuring that the men were truly gone, that the island was once again secure. But something kept him rooted to the spot. He glanced at the Grebes, their heads low, their bodies still, as they resumed their ancient rituals. The land was theirs now. His presence here had merely been a bridge between the past and the present, a temporary guardian. He looked down at the ground, then back at the trees that surrounded him. The forest, so dense and alive, felt suddenly different. Not hostile, but watchful, as if the earth itself were awake, alert to the subtle stirrings of every creature that moved within it. And then, just as he began to turn back toward the edge of the cove, he heard it. A sound so faint, yet so distinct it stopped him in his tracks. A rustle. Not the wind or the movement of branches, but something deliberate, something human? His pulse quickened. Elliot's instinct was to move, to melt into the shadows, to blend in with the world he had come to understand. But he couldn't shake the sense that the forest itself was pulling him toward something. He took one slow step, then another, each movement calculated, the weight of the moment heavy on his shoulders. The air had changed again. It was thicker, somehow, the smell of the sea faintly mingling with the scent of wet earth and pine. There, at the edge of the trees, he saw a shadow shift. Too fluid to be a mere animal. He froze, his eyes narrowing. It was him, the second poacher, the one who had remained hidden, observing. But this time, there was something different about him. He wasn't moving with the same purpose as before. He wasn't focused on the Grebes anymore. His posture was rigid, almost tense, as if waiting. And Elliot understood in an instant that this man wasn't alone. His breath caught. Another figure, tall, imposing, emerged from the shadows, a shape that seemed almost too large to be human. Elliot's heart drummed in his chest, the hairs on the back of his neck standing straight. This figure was darker, more ominous. Something about its presence was wrong, an unnatural weight hanging in the air. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, a single sharp cry echoed through the trees, the unmistakable call of the Great Crested Grebe, the sound that had guided Elliot to this sanctuary in the first place. It was a warning, a plea for protection. The two men didn't flinch. They didn't even turn to look. Instead, the larger figure, whose outline now seemed more distinct, stepped forward, moving with an eerie calm as if this was all part of some strange ritual. A low growl rumbled in the air, not from the men, but from something else. Something far deeper in the forest, something that made Elliot's blood run cold. The Grebes in the cove began to stir, their soft cries turning anxious, a fluttering mass of wings and movement. Elliot watched, breathless, as the larger figure raised a hand. The action was slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. And then the shadows parted. From the dense underbrush emerged a massive bird, bigger than any grebe, with feathers that shimmered in the dim light as if they were made of night itself. Its wings, broad and powerful, cut through the air with a sound that echoed like thunder. Its beak, long and jagged, gleamed with an unnatural sharpness. It was a creature that should not exist, a hybrid of some kind, a monstrous distortion of nature, crafted in secret, born from the twisted machinations of those who had long sought to exploit the beauty of these birds for their own gain. Elliot's throat went dry. He realized too late that this wasn't just about poaching anymore. The men had come here for something more than feathers. They had come for the creatures that had returned, the ones who had found refuge here, far from human interference. The island, this haven for the Grebes, had become the center of something darker, an experiment, a forbidden creation, a manipulation of nature's course. The larger bird circled slowly, its eyes wild, unsettling, fixated on the poachers. It was as if it recognized them, as if it knew who had summoned it. Without warning, the bird lunged. The men scrambled, trying to retreat into the trees, but the creature was faster. Too fast. Its massive wings swept down with a deafening crack, sending one of the poachers tumbling to the ground. Elliot watched in frozen silence as the larger bird pinned him down, its beak snapping and claws slashing in a blur of movement. The second poacher, now desperate, turned and ran toward the edge of the forest, his movements frantic. But the creature didn't follow. It was intent on its prey, its task clear. It was protecting something, perhaps the land itself, perhaps the creatures it had been born to guard. Elliot's pulse raced. He wasn't sure what to do. Should he intervene? Should he try to stop it? But the twisted bird had already rendered its judgment. It wasn't here for him. It wasn't here for the Grebes. It was here to enforce the laws of nature that humans had long ignored. As the wind shifted once more, Elliot's mind cleared. He understood now. The balance of this place had been disturbed for too long. The sanctuary had become something more than a haven. It had become a battleground for survival, a place where the consequences of human greed were paid in blood. The forest had spoken. The Grebes, the creature, the island, they were all part of a larger, intricate web. And Elliot, as much as he had tried to protect them, was only one small thread in its vast tapestry. He stepped back into the shadows, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on his chest. The forest, the birds, the creature, they were all watching him now. He wasn't sure what the future held for this island, but one thing was clear. Nature would find its own way to balance things, no matter the cost. And as the wind picked up once more, scattering the remnants of feathers through the trees, Elliot disappeared into the thickening mist, leaving behind a place that was no longer just a sanctuary, but something much more powerful, much more mysterious. The forest felt quieter now, as if the very trees were holding their breath, waiting for the next movement in the unfolding drama. The wind had settled, leaving only the soft whisper of leaves brushing against each other. The unnatural screeching of the large bird had faded, replaced by the distant crackle of breaking branches as the poacher, still alive though barely, scrambled in panic toward the cliff's edge. His movements were desperate, erratic, a man overwhelmed by something he couldn't possibly understand. Elliot stood motionless, his body rooted to the earth, the weight of his breath heavy in his chest. The sounds of the forest had resumed, birdsong, the occasional rustle of unseen animals in the underbrush. But they no longer held the same peace they once did. A new tension had crept in, as if the land itself had shifted in response to what had just happened. The bird, the creature that had emerged from the shadows of the island, was still there, lingering over the fallen poacher like a shadow cast by some otherworldly force. Its presence was undeniable, unsettling. The twisted amalgamation of feathers and muscle was no longer just an animal. It had become a symbol, an enforcer of the island's unspoken law, a reminder that even in this remote corner of the world, nature had its own ways of dealing with intruders. Elliot's eyes flicked to the cove, where the grebes were still huddled around their nests, their plumage rustling softly in the breeze. They appeared unbothered, but Elliot knew better. They were deeply connected to the island, to the land that had taken them in, and they had known something long before he did, that the balance was precarious. He had thought that the work he was doing here, the protection he had offered, was enough. But now, after seeing the twisted creature and the lengths to which nature had gone to defend itself, Elliot realized that his understanding had been far too limited. The creature's large form was slowly retreating back into the shadows, its wings folding in a silent display of dominance, as if it were giving the poacher one last chance to flee. But it didn't move far. It was always watching, always waiting. Elliot felt his legs begin to move, his mind still reeling, a sense of urgency driving him forward. He didn't know why he was drawn to the cliffside, but it was impossible to ignore the pull. His instinct was to check on the poacher, to ensure he was truly gone, though a small voice in his head warned that getting too close could be a grave mistake. The rocks near the edge were slick, wet from the mist that had begun to roll in from the sea. Elliot's footing was uncertain, but he pressed forward, his heart pounding in his chest, louder than the wind. The distant cries of the grebes, their high-pitched calls rising from the cove below, reminded him of the precariousness of it all. There was something about this island now, something in the air, that felt entirely foreign. As he reached the edge of the cliff, he saw the poacher. He was kneeling in the dirt, his face bloodied and his eyes wide with fear, still shaking. He looked up at Elliot, but there was no recognition in his eyes, just a wild terror. A man on the brink of losing his mind. For a moment, Elliot considered calling out to him, but something stopped him. A strange sensation crept over him, an instinct that whispered, "Stay back." He watched the poacher, now struggling to rise, his body unsteady as if every movement was an effort against some invisible force. The air around him seemed to vibrate with an oppressive weight, something suffocating, as though the very atmosphere of the island had grown thick, alive with an unseen energy.